Snow had swallowed the Allagash forest when Gideon Rusk started his saw. Then a wounded German shepherd stepped from the trees and placed one paw on the log. She was freezing, bleeding, and still carrying milk for puppies he could not see. Instead of resting, she kept turning toward an abandoned K-9 academy hidden beyond the pines. What Gideon found there would force police departments to question every certificate they had trusted. But the hardest truth was not about the academy. It was about how long good people had stayed silent. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. The first heavy snow of winter always arrived in Allagash with the manners of an occupying army. It came without hurry and without apology, whitening the logging roads, swallowing old tire tracks, and bending the black spruce until their branches looked burdened by thought. By dawn, the lake beyond Gideon Rusk's camp had gone gray beneath a skin of new ice. The surface shifted and groaned softly, as though something large were turning in its sleep below. Gideon had been listening to it since before sunrise. He was 52, tall enough that the low ridge of his canvas tent made him stoop, with broad shoulders and the lean, weathered strength of a man who still split his own wood. His face was angular, clean-shaven, and marked more by restraint than age. Dark ash-brown hair, silvering at both temples, was cut in a neat undercut that the wool cap had already ruined. His eyes were gray-green in the winter light, watchful without appearing restless. He wore an olive-drab combat shirt beneath an open field jacket, the camouflage sleeves faded from years of washing. The clothes had once belonged to a world of orders, maps, and clear objectives. Now they were simply warm and difficult to tear. Every year, when the first real snow came, Gideon drove north alone. He told no one exactly where he camped. He turned off his phone at the final fuel station and left it sealed inside the glove compartment. He brought enough food for 4 days, though he usually stayed 3. He brought coffee, an old steel pot, a folding saw, and the gray wool scarf that had once belonged to his wife. Naomi had been dead 7 years. There were gentler ways to say it, but Gideon distrusted gentler language. It suggested that words could alter the shape of facts. Her car had slid through a guardrail on a road glazed with freezing rain while he was working maritime security in Virginia. She had called him 3 times. The calls had come during a briefing, and Gideon had silenced the phone without looking. For years he had imagined the phone lighting on the table. Once, twice, 3 times. He never imagined what she might have said. That would have required hope, and hope had become one of the few dangers Gideon preferred not to approach unprepared. So he came to Allagash every winter and worked until his hands hurt. Work was honest. A knot in a rope either held or did not. A tent stood or collapsed. Firewood burned only after someone carried it. Grief, by contrast, could sit beside a man for 7 years and still refuse to explain what it wanted. On the second morning, Gideon found that one of the main tent stakes had loosened during the night. The wind off the lake had worried the frozen soil until the line sagged. He chose a short section of dead pine and carried it to a clearing near the fire ring. The saw started on the second pull. Its engine cut through the silence with a hard mechanical snarl. Snow shivered from the lower branches. Gideon braced one boot against the log and lowered the blade. He nearly missed the movement between the trees. At first it was only a dark shape crossing white ground. Too low for a deer, too deliberate for a fox. It stopped behind a stand of young spruce, vanished, then emerged again. A German shepherd. Female, Gideon saw at once. She moved with her head low and her back slightly curved, not in submission, but exhaustion. Her coat was black and wheat gold, though ice had stiffened the longer fur beneath her belly and legs into pale spikes. A wide charcoal saddle covered her back, broken by a narrow stripe of gold that wandered slightly to the right of her spine. Her left ear bent faintly near the tip, where a small crescent-shaped notch interrupted the outer edge. She was thin, too thin. Her belly, however, was heavy with milk. Gideon eased his hand from the saw's throttle, but did not shut it off yet. He knew frightened dogs. Sudden silence could be as alarming as sudden noise. The shepherd advanced several feet, stopped, and looked at him. Her eyes were amber-brown and darker around the left one, where the black mask spread unevenly across her face. Beneath the right eye, a pale crescent of gold made her expression appear permanently questioning. Blood had dried around her left hind leg. A strip of blue nylon was tangled above the hock, rubbed deeply enough to leave the surrounding fur raw and sparse. One claw was split. Her tracks behind her were staggered, with long troughs where her body had collapsed into the snow. She had not walked to him easily. She had walked because stopping had not been permitted. "Easy," Gideon said. The dog did not react to the word. Her gaze shifted toward the saw. Gideon released the trigger. The engine slowed, but continued to chatter. The shepherd came closer. 10 feet. 6. 3. Every instinct told him not to move quickly. She was injured, recently whelped, and carrying the sharp, guarded tension of an animal that had learned hands could mean restraint. Then she did something Gideon had never seen a frightened dog do. She stepped over the churned snow, raised one front paw, and placed it on the pine log directly before the moving blade. Gideon killed the engine. The saw coughed once and fell silent. For a moment, nothing existed but the tick of cooling metal and the dog's ragged breathing. She did not remove her paw. Gideon stared at her face, and memory opened with the clean surprise of a door in wind. A chain-link run behind a low training building, a stainless steel water bowl overturned in frozen mud, the same uneven mask, the same left ear. A year earlier, Northwood's K-9 Academy had hired him to repair a generator after an early cold snap. The academy sat less than half a mile east of his winter camp, though the forest made it feel farther. Its advertisements promised professional working dogs for rural police departments across northern Maine. While replacing a fuel line, Gideon had noticed a shepherd isolated behind the main kennels. She had not barked. She had watched. When he carried a fresh water bowl toward the fence, she had retreated so violently that her shoulder struck the rear panel. Gideon had set the bowl down and sat outside the run instead. He had stayed there nearly an hour, saying almost nothing, until the dog finally crossed the mud and drank without taking her eyes off him. One of the handlers had laughed. "She remembers weakness," the man had said. Gideon had looked at the dog and thought the opposite. She remembered danger. Now, standing before his saw, she remembered him. "Well," he murmured, "that makes two of us with questionable judgment." The shepherd's paw slipped from the log. Her body followed. Gideon caught her before her chest struck the snow. She stiffened in his hands, but did not bite. Beneath the frozen coat, her ribs felt narrow and sharp. Her heartbeat raced against his palm. He lowered her onto his ground tarp and stepped back immediately. The dog tried to rise. No. She rose anyway, managed one step, and collapsed toward the east. Gideon followed the direction of her muzzle. Beyond the trees lay the old logging road. Beyond that, Northwoods. He brought warm water from the pot and placed it near her. She drank twice, stopped, and turned away from the bowl. When he laid the gray wool blanket beside her, she ignored that too. Her nose remained pointed east. Gideon cleaned the leg as carefully as he could. The blue nylon had not been tied there deliberately. It looked like part of a restraint or kennel lead she had dragged loose. The skin beneath it was abraded, but not deeply cut. The split claw had bled more than the injury deserved, as claws often did. He wrapped the leg with gauze from his field kit. The shepherd watched every movement. When his hand approached too close to her belly, her lips lifted. Not much. Enough. "All right," Gideon said, withdrawing. "Your terms." The words startled him. Naomi used to say that animals and marriage both improved when a man learned not every boundary was an insult. Gideon looked at the dog again. "You need a name if you plan to overrule me." The winter sky had brightened through the trees. Somewhere beyond the cloud, daylight pressed against the forest without warmth. Naomi had loved constellations, not in any scholarly way. She confused planets with stars and once insisted Orion was showing off. But she had known Vela, the sails of an ancient ship, because her father had taught her to find it during winters in Arizona. "Vela," Gideon said. The shepherd's left ear moved. It was not recognition. It was only sound. Still he repeated it. "Vela?" She pushed herself up again. This time Gideon saw something change before she moved. Not panic, decision. Vela dragged one front paw forward, then the other. Her injured rear leg folded beneath her, but she kept crawling toward the logging road. The need in her was larger than pain. Gideon felt an old resistance rise in him. Not fear, something more practiced. He had come here to disappear for 3 days. He had chosen solitude with care. It was the only ritual he still trusted. The date of Naomi's death waited less than 24 hours away, and he had planned every hour around not speaking to anyone, not being needed, not allowing the world to place another living thing in his hands. Vela crawled another foot. Then she turned her head and looked back at him. There was no pleading in her expression now, only expectation, as if she had already made the difficult part of the decision and was waiting for him to stop pretending he had not been included. Gideon exhaled through his nose. "Fine." He retrieved his phone from the truck and powered it on. The screen filled with ordinary neglect. 2 weather alerts, a voicemail from a contractor, a message from the grocery store announcing discounted coffee. Nothing from the dead. Nothing that explained why turning the phone on felt like admitting defeat. He called emergency dispatch and described Vela's condition, her recent lactation, the restraint injury, and the direction she was trying to travel. The dispatcher connected him to Sheriff June Treadwell. June's voice came over the line low and fully awake. Gideon knew her by reputation and from 2 county rescue operations years before. She was 58, disciplined, unhurried, and famous for making reckless men feel childish without raising her voice. "Northwoods claims they're closed for heating repairs," she said after hearing him out. "The gate may still be accessible from the old logging road." "You on their property?" "Not yet." "Keep it that way unless you have direct evidence of an animal in immediate danger. If you hear something, see blood, see confinement, call me before you force entry. I'm sending a deputy and animal welfare, but roads are slow." Gideon looked at Vela. She had stopped crawling only because she no longer had strength. How slow? 45 minutes if the plow ahead of them behaves. It won't. "No," June said. "It rarely respects authority." The dry remark almost sounded like kindness. Gideon ended the call and pulled the utility sled from beneath a tarp near his truck. He lined it with the gray blanket, then approached Vela sideways, keeping his hands low. "I'm going to move you," he said. "You can disapprove after." Vela tensed when he lifted her, but she did not struggle. The moment she settled onto the sled, she turned her face east. Gideon clipped the tow line to his belt and started down the old road. The snow was bright enough to hurt his eyes. Sunlight passed through the spruce in narrow white columns, illuminating crystals suspended in the cold air. Behind him, the sled whispered over powder. Twice, Gideon looked back to make sure Vela was still conscious. Each time, she was watching the road ahead. Northwoods appeared gradually through the trees. First, the dark roof of the training hall, then the blue sign beside the gate, then the kennels, arranged in rigid rows beneath caps of snow. The main gate stood open. No tire tracks entered or left. No smoke rose from the chimneys. Most unsettling of all, no dogs barked. Vela began to whine. The sound was low at first, trapped in her throat. Then it sharpened. She struggled upright on the sled. "Stay down." Vela jumped. Her legs buckled when she hit the snow, but she recovered before Gideon could reach her. She limped across the silent yard, past the main building, heading toward a wooden storage shed behind the kennel runs. Gideon followed, one hand near his phone. The shed door hung partly open. Inside, light entered through gaps in the siding, striping old feed bins, broken agility equipment, and stacked training mats. Vela went straight to the rear corner. She pawed at the floor. Once. Again. The boards there were newer than the rest, fixed with bright nail heads that had not yet rusted. Gideon crouched. "June," he said into the phone as the call connected. "I'm inside an open storage building. The dog is indicating beneath the floor. There's fresh construction." "Do you hear anything?" At first he did not. Vela scratched again, harder, then pressed her nose to the narrow seam between two boards. The sound came from below, so faint that Gideon felt it before he understood it. A small, strained cry. Then silence. His hand flattened against the cold wood. A second cry answered from farther beneath the floor. Vela made a broken sound and dug until one nail tore skin from her paw. Gideon pulled her back. Below them, a third voice began to cry. Gideon did not pull up the board immediately. He kept one palm flat against the wood and raised the phone with the other, turning the camera toward the fresh nail heads, the blood on Vela's paw, and the narrow seam where warm breath seemed to gather beneath the floor. 3 separate cries, he told June. Weak, one closer to the west wall. "Keep recording," she said. Her voice had lost its dry edge. "Show the room before you touch anything." Gideon turned slowly, capturing the open shed door, the stacked mats, the feed bins, and Vela crouched beside the repaired section of flooring. Her body shook with the effort of staying upright. "No lock's broken," he said. "Door was open when I entered." "I heard you. Remove only what blocks access. Deputy is 28 minutes out. State welfare inspector is behind him." A tiny sound rose beneath Gideon's hand. Vela lunged at the seam. The movement ended badly. Her injured hind leg folded, and her shoulder struck the floor. She tried to rise before she had finished falling. Gideon put the phone against a feed bin where the camera could continue recording. "I'm going in now." June was silent for half a breath. "Save the animals," she said. "Do not search anything else." The bright nails came out too easily. That troubled him more than rust would have. Gideon worked the claw of a wrecking bar beneath the first plank and lifted. Cold air escaped through the gap, carrying the smell of wet straw, sour milk, and wood that had not seen daylight in years. Vela shoved her nose toward the opening. "Back!" She ignored him. He widened the gap another few inches and found a shallow utility cavity beneath the floor. An insulated pipe ran along one side, ticking softly as warm water moved through it. The line was doing just enough to keep the darkness from freezing solid. A wooden crate sat beneath the beams. It had been lined with old training felt, straw, and 2 veterinary warming pouches that had gone cold. The arrangement was not accidental. Someone had made a place for newborns, then abandoned it before finishing whatever plan had required concealment. Gideon lowered himself onto one elbow. The first puppy was nearly black, a small male curled against the side of the crate. His paws moved in shallow, furious jerks. Beside him lay another male with pale gold forelegs, mouth opening around a cry too weak to become sound. The third puppy was smaller. Female, Gideon thought. A cream patch marked the underside of her chin. She lay beneath the others without moving. For 1 second, the cavity became another confined place from another life. Bad air, limited light, a body too still while time narrowed around it. Gideon made himself count. 1 pipe, 4 joists, 3 puppies, one breathing adult dog above him. He reached for the smallest. Vela's teeth snapped shut less than an inch from his wrist. Gideon stopped. She had dragged herself halfway into the opening, ribs pressing against the broken edge of the floor. Her lips had pulled back, but the rest of her face held no rage, only terror sharpened by memory. He did not pull away quickly. Fast withdrawal could look like guilt to a frightened animal. "Gideon," he said quietly. Vela's eyes stayed on his hand. "My name is Gideon." He had spoken those words to her once before, outside a chain-link run, while a generator coughed itself back to life. The old machine had made an uneven 3-beat rattle after each failed start. Gideon remembered the sound because the shepherd had flinched at every burst, then edged toward the water bowl only when the engine settled into a low hum. "You remember that generator," he said. "Fuel line split, near the coupling. Man in the red cap blamed the weather because the weather couldn't argue." Her growl weakened, but did not stop. Gideon lowered his chest closer to the floor so he no longer loomed above her. "I brought the water," he continued. "You waited until I moved away." Vela's nostrils worked. "You don't have to trust me. You only have to let me lift the box." The words sounded strange even to him, not because he expected her to understand language, but because he had spent years treating trust as a complete structure, either standing or ruined. Vela appeared to understand it as distance, a hand withdrawn when asked, a body turned sideways, a choice left open. Her lips settled over her teeth. Then, slowly, she backed out of the opening. Gideon slid both arms beneath the crate. It was heavier than it looked, not because of the puppies, but because the lower boards were soaked. He lifted carefully, maneuvering it between the joists. Vela paced beside him as well as her damaged leg allowed, pressing her nose to each corner of the crate. The smallest puppy still had not moved. Gideon carried them to the clearest patch of floor and stripped off his field jacket. He folded it beneath the crate to keep the cold boards from drawing away what little warmth remained. "June, I have them." "How many?" 3, 2 responsive, 1 severely cold. Help is 19 minutes out. 19 is long. I know. Gideon slid 2 fingers against the smallest puppy's ribs. There, a flutter so faint it might have been wishful thinking. Vela climbed into the crate, despite having no room to do it. She curved herself around the puppies, pushing the 2 males toward her belly. Then she nosed the smallest again and again. The dark male found milk first. His brother rooted in the wrong direction and complained in a breathy squeak. The female remained still. Gideon took the emergency blanket from his pack and built a loose tent around the crate, trapping warmth without covering Vela's face. He placed a bottle of warm, not hot, water against the outside wall and monitored the puppy's breathing. He wanted to rub her hard, force circulation back into the body, do something decisive. But newborns could be harmed by the urgency meant to save them, so he warmed her slowly. It required a kind of patience he had never respected enough. By the time tires ground across the yard, the smallest puppy had moved 1 rear foot. A dark green 4-wheel drive veterinary truck stopped beside the shed. The driver's door opened before the engine had fully settled. Dr. Odalis Ferreira came in carrying a worn oxblood medical bag and a folded warming pad under one arm. She was 47, compact and sure-footed, with brown olive skin reddened by the cold and dark hair twisted into a low knot beneath a wine-colored cap. Square bronze-framed glasses caught the light when she looked from Gideon to the crate. "Tell me what you touched." "The floorboards, crate, emergency blanket, warm water bottle. I checked respiration on the smallest." "Good. Tell me what you did not do." "Feed them. Heat them directly. Separate them from the mother." Odalis nodded once. "Excellent. A man who follows instructions. I should document the sighting." She knelt beside Vela without facing her directly. Her medical bag remained closed. Vela growled. "Reasonable," Odalis said. "I dislike strangers entering my workplace too." Gideon almost answered, but the smallest puppy made a thin clicking sound. Odalis's attention narrowed. She opened the bag and moved quickly without appearing hurried. A thermal probe, glucose gel, warm towels, a stethoscope small enough for an animal that fit in one hand. Vela blocked her first approach. Gideon sat beside the crate. "No one takes them," he told the dog. Odalis glanced at him. "Is that a promise you're authorized to make?" "No." "Good. The dangerous ones usually sound more certain." Gideon held Vela's gaze while Odalis reached beneath her chest. The shepherd trembled, but allowed the examination. "Severe dehydration," Odalis said. "Poor body condition. Early mastitis, likely one gland worse than the others. Restraint abrasion on the left hind leg. Split claw. No obvious fracture." "And the pups?" "Cold. Premature, I think. Not by much." She touched the smallest puppy's gums with glucose. "This one is the problem?" The tiny female opened her mouth. No cry came. Odalis wrapped her in a warm cloth and held her close to the heating pad. Gideon watched her work. The waiting felt unlike the silence of his camp. This silence contained purpose. It belonged to several people doing different tasks around the same fragile center. That unsettled him more than loneliness ever had. The deputy arrived with Wesley Pike, the state animal welfare inspector. Wesley was a narrow, long-limbed man in his early 60s, dressed in a faded brown parka and snow gaiters marked with road salt. His face looked carved by years of outdoor work, but his voice was mild. He did not approach Vela. Instead, he stood at the entrance and photographed the room from several angles. "Mr. Rusk, once the animals are moved, I'll need your original video sent directly to the evidence address. No editing, no clipping." "You'll have it." "Did you open cabinets?" "No." "Touch paperwork?" "Didn't see any." Wesley's eyes moved to the newer floorboards. "That's enough for now." The deputy stretched barrier tape across the shed while Wesley documented the utility cavity, the insulated pipe, the cold warming pouches, and the crate. Nothing was dramatic. No hidden ledger waited beneath the straw. No confession had been nailed to the wall. Only arrangements that did not agree with the public story of an empty facility. Odalis lifted the smallest puppy slightly. A sound came from the cloth. It was no louder than a fingernail brushing paper. Vela's head came up. The puppy cried again. Odalis released a breath and looked at Gideon over her glasses. "She has opinions. That helps." "What are her chances?" "Better than they were 10 minutes ago. Worse than I'd like." It was the sort of answer Gideon trusted. Wesley examined the exterior kennels while Odalis prepared Vela and the puppies for transport. The front runs were empty, bowls stacked neatly inside as if for an inspection. Behind the training hall, however, a row of smaller pens still contained flattened straw, feces too recent to have survived since autumn, and scrape marks around several latches. Near one gate, Wesley found a white identification board, half hidden behind a broken panel. The number written beside the empty run was 14B. He scanned Vela's microchip while Odalis kept one hand against her shoulder. The scanner displayed a different identification number than the board's handwritten record. Wesley said nothing for several seconds. Then he photographed both. At the edge of the yard stood a steel burn barrel crusted with snow. The deputy checked it only after Wesley established the search boundary permitted by the emergency welfare response. Inside were damp ashes and several pieces of paper protected from complete burning by a collapsed metal folder. One fragment carried the partial name of a police department. Another showed a vaccination table with identical handwriting in 2 signature fields. A torn strip from a transport schedule contained one surviving line, 14B, hold until litter stable. Odalis read it from where she knelt. Her expression changed, not dramatically, but enough for Gideon to notice. "You recognize something?" "The format," she said, "not the entry." Before he could ask more, she turned back to Vela. "Later. Right now she needs fluids, and the pups need controlled heat." A county technician found the surveillance cabinet in the office. The recording unit was gone, removed cleanly from its brackets. The power cable was still warm. Northwoods had not been abandoned for months. Someone had been there recently enough for the equipment to retain heat in an unheated room. By late afternoon, Wesley sealed the shed and office. The investigation would require warrants, records requests, and people whose jobs involved following lies through paperwork. The animals required something more immediate. Odalis used a hunting lodge 6 miles west as a temporary field clinic during winter livestock rounds. The owner kept one wing heated for emergencies, and the back entrance was wide enough to move Vela without forcing her through a public room. Gideon rode with them. He told himself it was because Vela refused to settle unless she could see him. This was true. It was not the whole truth. At the lodge, Odalis placed the puppies in a low warming box beside Vela's bedding. She labeled 3 medical charts. The dark male needs a name. Why? Because dark male becomes inconvenient after the 20th temperature reading. Gideon looked into the box. The darkest puppy had already pushed himself over his brother to reach the warmer side. Fable. Odalis wrote it down without asking why. The one with the pale forelegs? Bram. And the small female? The puppy with the cream patch beneath her chin lay wrapped against Vela's chest. Her breathing remained shallow but regular. Gideon thought of weak light crossing winter cloud. Lumen. Odalis printed the names across the charts, not permanent perhaps, but real enough to be spoken. That night, Vela refused sleep. She lay across the front edge of the warming box, her body forming a barrier between the puppies and the room. Every time Odalis crossed to the cabinet, Vela's ears followed. Every time Gideon shifted in the wooden chair near the wall, her gaze found him. He did not approach unless necessary. Near midnight, Wesley sent the preliminary intake sheet to Odalis's secure printer. The paper emerged with a quiet, mechanical hum. Gideon read the entry beneath the mismatched chip number. Breeding asset 14B, no name. Below it, someone had typed, unsuitable for training. Repeated command breaks when intervening on behalf of weaker dogs. Gideon read the sentence twice. Across the room, Vela lowered her head beside Lumen, who had begun to nurse in brief, stubborn pulls. Northwoods had taken the finest thing in her and described it as defective, not because loyalty was unwanted, because hers could not be directed toward profit. By morning, the hunting lodge no longer felt like a temporary clinic. It had acquired the layered smell of warm milk, antiseptic, wet wool, coffee, and animals who had begun to believe they might see another day. Snowlight entered through the narrow windows and lay in pale rectangles across the pine floor. Vela remained beside the warming box. She had slept in fragments, never long enough for her muscles to fully loosen. Bram and Fable nursed with increasing determination. Lumen still required help finding the right place, but she had developed a faint, irritated squeak whenever Odalis moved her too slowly. Gideon considered irritation an encouraging medical sign. Dr. Odalis Ferreira sat at a folding table near the stove, comparing photographs from Northwoods with the papers Wesley Pike had recovered. Her dark hair had escaped its knot in several places. A mug of coffee stood beside her untouched, cold enough to qualify as evidence. Sheriff June Treadwell arrived shortly after 7. She came without ceremony, carrying a cardboard tray of coffee and a red file folder under one arm. Her dark brown parka was unzipped, despite the cold. Beneath it, the tan sheriff's shirt sat straight across her compact shoulders, every button aligned as if disorder were a personal challenge. Her salt and pepper hair was cut short and swept to one side. A narrow scar interrupted her left eyebrow, giving her blue-gray eyes a permanently skeptical cast. June placed the coffee on the table. "One of these contains enough sugar to restart a stalled snowplow," she said. "I don't remember which." Odalis lifted the nearest cup. "Then today has chosen for me." June's attention moved to Vela and the puppies. She did not approach. That earned her a brief look from Vela instead of a growl. "How's the small one?" "Still fragile," Odalis said. "But Lumen has begun objecting to treatment, which makes her my favorite patient before breakfast." June nodded, but Gideon noticed that she kept one hand on the red file. "What's in there?" he asked. June looked at him. "A mistake with teeth?" She opened the folder. The first page held a purchase contract from Northwood's K-9 Academy. The amount was large enough to make Gideon's jaw tighten. The second page was a certification profile for a 6-year-old German Shepherd named Rook. Search qualified, controlled apprehension, narcotics detection, urban environmental stability. The document looked impressive because it had been designed to look impressive. Seals, tables, signatures, neat blocks of language that implied someone competent had measured something real. 2 years ago, June said, my office bought Rook from Northwoods. Gideon turned a page. The photograph showed a broad-chested male with a heavy charcoal saddle and a black marking that ran down from his neck like an arrowhead. Where is he now? At my station. Working? June's mouth flattened. Not in the role we bought him for. She explained without softening it. Rook had failed basic search patterns within weeks. He startled violently at sirens. A dropped metal pan sent him into the corner of a training room, where he remained until June herself sat on the floor and waited for him to come out. During a narcotics exercise, he ignored every planted sample and found a custodian eating chicken behind the maintenance shed. Odalis glanced up. Technically, he detected something. June gave her a look. It was not contraband chicken. The humor passed quickly. June had filed 2 formal complaints with Northwoods. Silas Ketteridge answered both with polished letters, blaming handler inconsistency, environmental transition, and insufficient reinforcement. The county board refused to pay for an independent assessment. So you retired him? Gideon asked. No, I removed him from patrol work. He does controlled appearances, demonstrations without noise or crowd pressure. He stays with me most nights. You kept the purchase quiet. June's shoulders settled a fraction. I kept the extent of the failure quiet. Gideon closed the folder. That distinction matters to you? It should matter to anyone who understands consequences. It matters to Northwoods. June met his stare. You think I don't know that? The room changed. Vela lifted her head, reacting not to volume, but pressure. Gideon lowered his voice, though the anger remained. You had a dog sold under false credentials. You had proof something was wrong. I had proof that one dog did not perform as advertised. You had enough to ask harder questions. I did ask. You accepted the answer. June took off her gloves and laid them carefully beside the folder. I asked for money to evaluate him independently. The board said no. I asked Northwoods for a refund. They threatened litigation and claimed my handler had ruined a valuable animal. I spoke to 2 other departments. Neither admitted problems. So you stopped. I protected the program I still had. By pretending it worked? June's eyes hardened. By keeping Rook out of situations where he could fail publicly and be labeled dangerous, by keeping my handler employed, by preventing the county from shutting down the entire K-9 budget because one purchase embarrassed them. Gideon leaned forward. And how many dogs did Northwood sell after that? The question landed cleanly. June did not answer at once. The silence was not surrender. It was accounting. "Too many," she said. Odalis rose before Gideon could continue. "Both of you are enjoying the moral high ground, far too much for men and women standing in the same valley." June looked toward her. Odalis slid a photocopied medical form across the table. "My name is on that." The signature read, Dr. Odalis Ferreira, D.V.M. The handwriting was nearly convincing. Nearly. "I never examined this dog," she said. "I never signed this certificate." But June picked up the page. "Could it be an older form?" "No. The date is 8 months after I ended my contract with Northwoods." Gideon looked at her. "You worked for them?" "Twice a month for almost a year." The admission carried no drama. That made it heavier. Odalis told them she had performed vaccinations, minor injury treatment, and routine health checks. At first, Northwoods presented itself as underfunded, but earnest. The kennels shown to her were clean. The dogs were nervous, but working dogs in unfamiliar environments often were. Then she noticed inconsistencies. Animals vanished from the schedule without transfer records. Dogs listed as being housed in the rear block were always off-site for training when she requested access. Medication logs contained dosages that did not match the animals' recorded weights. The third time Odalis asked to inspect the rear kennels, Silas told her the area was restricted because several dogs were undergoing behavioral decompression. "I sent a concern report to the state," she said. "What happened?" June asked. "It lacked dates, photographs, animal identification numbers. I had suspicion and no clean chain of evidence. They requested more information." "And?" Odalis looked at the warming box. "I did not go back." Lumen squeaked as Bram rolled against her. Odalis adjusted the towel with 2 fingers. "My mobile practice depends on access to farms and municipal contracts. Silas knew people on 3 county boards. He told me that accusations could make rural clients wonder whether I was trustworthy." "You believed him?" Gideon asked. "I believed he could make the threat expensive." The answer held no request for forgiveness. "I told myself leaving meant I would no longer lend legitimacy to the place," she continued. "That was partly true. It was also convenient." June looked down at her gloves. The anger between her and Gideon had nowhere easy to go now. Odalis had removed the luxury of choosing one guilty silence. A truck pulled into the lodge parking lot. Not a county vehicle. An older pickup with mismatched doors and a plow frame, but no blade. Wesley Pike entered first, carrying a sealed evidence case. Behind him came a man who stopped just inside the threshold, as if expecting to be told he had no right to warmth. Caleb Morrow was 61 and built like someone who had spent most of his life lifting 50-pound feed bags without ever calling it exercise. His shoulders had rounded forward with age. A faded cap covered thinning silver hair, and his short gray beard had been trimmed unevenly with practical neglect. A ring of old keys hung from his belt. They made a soft metallic sound when he walked. Vela heard them. Her body rose between the door and the puppies before any human reacted. Caleb stopped. The color left his face. "Take those off," Gideon said. Caleb looked down at the keys, then unhooked them slowly. He placed them on the floor and pushed them away with his boot. Vela did not relax. Caleb removed his cap. "Hello, girl." The words were quiet and ruined. Vela stared at him. No tail movement, no recognition offered for his comfort. Only memory. Wesley positioned himself between Caleb and the room without making it obvious. Mr. Morrow managed Northwood's kennel operations for 8 years, he said. He contacted the state hotline this morning after seeing the closure notice. Caleb's pale brown eyes remained on Vela. I should have called sooner. Yes, Gideon said. June's gaze warned him, but Caleb nodded. I should have. He sat in the chair nearest the door, keeping his hands visible. The story came out without order at first. Northwoods had not truly closed for repairs. Silas had moved the most presentable dogs to an affiliated training property farther south. Breeding females, medically questionable dogs, and animals awaiting altered paperwork stayed behind. Food portions had been cut to lower expenses and keep certain dogs lean for sales photographs. Lean photographs better, Caleb said bitterly. That's what Silas used to say. Vela had been isolated after repeatedly interfering when handlers corrected weaker dogs. She would break position, place herself between them, and refuse recall until the other dog was removed. Silas called it handler defiance. Caleb called it the only decent thing happening in the room. When Vela became pregnant, her status changed from training prospect to breeding stock. When she went into labor early, Silas panicked. A scheduled insurance inspection was approaching, and Vela's condition would expose the false health reports. Caleb was ordered to move her to the old storage shed. You built the crate? Odalis asked. I lined it, put the warming pouches in, kept the pipe running. You left her under the floor. His face folded inward. I put her there because Silas said a transport was coming by morning. Then the storm worsened. He told me not to return. And you listened, Gideon said. Caleb's jaw worked. I went back after midnight. The main gate camera was on. Marcel Dane's truck was there. I lost my nerve. Gideon stood. Vela followed the movement, tense again. You lost your nerve while she was giving birth under a floor. I know. You could have taken her. I know. You could have called June. I know. Caleb's voice rose only on the last word, not in defense, but pain. I knew the sheriff's office had bought Rook. I knew Northwoods had lawyers. Silas had already told me he'd take my pension apart with a lawsuit and make sure every shelter in the state knew I'd participated. You had participated? Yes. The single word stopped Gideon more effectively than an argument would have. Caleb did not offer fear as innocence. He reached inside his canvas jacket and removed a folded photograph. It showed Gideon beside the generator 1 year earlier, crouched outside Vela's run while she drank from the bowl he had brought. I took this for the maintenance record, Caleb said. After you left, she kept going back to the fence where you'd been. Gideon took the photograph. Vela was thinner then, but not yet skeletal. Her left ear tilted toward him. I knew you camped west of the academy every first snow, Caleb continued. Staff joked about the ex-SEAL living in the woods. When things got worse, I left your old work glove near her kennel. You dropped it by the generator shed last year. Gideon looked at him sharply. You sent her toward me? No, I gave her a scent she knew. I opened the secondary latch before I quit. I hoped if she ever got out, she'd go somewhere that didn't smell like us. It wasn't at rescue. It was not nothing. That was the cruelty of it. Caleb had done enough to prove he understood the danger, but not enough to bear the risk himself. Gideon looked down at the photograph again. For years he had divided people into those who acted and those who failed. It was a useful division under fire. It was less useful in rooms where fear accumulated by inches. June folded her arms. Will you make a formal statement? Caleb looked at Vela. Yes. Under oath? Yes. Knowing Silas will claim you were responsible for kennel conditions? Caleb picked up the ring of keys from the floor. He held them in his palm, but did not return them to his belt. I was responsible for some of them. Wesley watched him carefully. "That answer won't protect you." "It shouldn't." The lodge fell quiet again, not the tense silence from earlier. Something rougher, a space where blame remained, but no longer had the simplicity Gideon wanted from it. June opened the red folder and added Caleb's name to a blank page. O'Dallas bagged the forged medical form. Wesley prepared the recorder. 4 people began building a case from the places where each of them had once stopped. Vela lowered herself beside the warming box, still watching Caleb. She did not forgive him. She did not need to. Near noon, Elias Penn from the Maine Attorney General's office joined by video call, his face appearing on O'Dallas's laptop between stacks of county contracts. He was a narrow-faced man in his mid-40s, wearing a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he listened longer than he spoke. When Caleb finished, Elias asked precise questions about dates, payment codes, transport vehicles, and who had access to the medical templates. Dr. Maren Holt joined the same call later from a training facility near Bangor. Her chin-length ash-blonde hair was tucked behind one ear, and her voice was so quiet that everyone in the lodge leaned closer. She did not ask whether Rook was brave. She asked what surfaces he avoided, where his nose pointed in wind, what happened before he froze, and whether anyone had ever evaluated him outside the skills Northwoods claimed to sell. June answered every question. For the first time, she did not protect the program by making it sound better. When the calls ended, the investigation had widened beyond animal neglect. Contract fraud, forged veterinary records, false certification, public purchasing failures. But no arrest came. No dramatic certainty entered the room. Only work. Gideon stood beside Vela before leaving for fresh clothes and supplies. She watched his hand approach. He stopped before touching her. Vela leaned forward and placed her nose briefly against his wrist. The gesture lasted less than a second. Then she returned to Lumen. Gideon understood the terms. Trust would not erase what had happened. It would only decide what happened next. The call came before sunrise, while the lodge windows were still black mirrors. June Treadwell was halfway through reheating yesterday's coffee when her radio announced that a county road maintenance truck had gone through the guardrail near Umsaskis Lake. The driver was missing. By the time she reached the roadside, dawn had begun to thin the darkness into blue. The truck rested nose down among young spruce, one rear wheel still turning slowly above the snow. The driver's door hung open. A broken trail of footprints led uphill from the cab, crossed the road, then disappeared where wind had pushed fresh powder across the shoulder. The missing man was Harlan Vick, 56, a county maintenance worker who knew the roads better than most people knew their own kitchens. His lunchbox remained in the cab. So did one glove. The other lay 30 feet away beside a streak of blood no wider than a finger. June stood beside the open door while a paramedic checked the seat and steering wheel. Head strike, the paramedic said, probably disoriented. Might not know where he is. The temperature was 9 degrees and falling. Beyond the road, the land sloped through thick spruce toward Umsaskis Lake. The shoreline was a confusion of snow-covered reeds, low willow, and pressure ridges where new ice had pushed against older ice. A professional search team was on its way from Bangor, but the weather had slowed them south of Millinocket. Estimated arrival, 4 hours. Harlan Vick did not have 4 hours. June looked toward the back of her cruiser. Rook sat behind the metal partition. He was larger than Vela, with a deep chest, heavy bones, and a charcoal saddle that covered most of his back. A black marking ran from the base of his neck toward his shoulders like a blunt arrow. Frost silvered the edges of his early gray muzzle. His right ear turned outward whenever he became uncertain. At that moment, it was nearly sideways. June opened the rear door. Rook did not move. "You don't have to impress anyone," she told him. The words were meant for the dog. They did not belong only to him. Dr. Marin Holt approached from the second vehicle, pulling on thin olive gloves. In person, she looked less severe than she had on the video call, though nothing in her manner invited carelessness. Her ash-blonde hair, cut level with her jaw, had been tucked behind both ears. A small red stopwatch hung from the zipper of her charcoal vest. She did not reach for Rook. Instead, she stood several feet away and turned her body partly sideways. "What happens when the siren starts?" she asked. "He folds," June said. "What happens in open country?" "He watches everything." "Does he track with his nose down?" "Not for long." Marin studied him through the open door. "Good." June frowned. "That is not the adjective usually used in his evaluations." "I'm not evaluating the paperwork." Rook stepped down from the cruiser. His nails touched packed snow. His body tightened when a rescue truck door slammed nearby, but he did not retreat. June clipped on a long red brick search line instead of the short black patrol lead Northwoods had provided. The old harness still carried the faded outline where the word patrol had been removed. Deputy Evan Coyle, Rook's assigned handler, joined them with a scent article sealed inside a plastic bag. Evan was 38, square-faced, and visibly exhausted from a night shift that had not yet ended. He had worked with Rook for nearly 2 years and carried the guilt of every failed exercise as if the dog had personally loaned it to him. "Harlan's spare cap," Evan said. He offered it to Rook. The dog sniffed once, then looked toward the truck. Evan gave the tracking command. Rook lowered his head and followed the visible footprints uphill. For 20 yards, the exercise resembled the training Northwoods claimed he knew. Then the trail vanished beneath wind-blown snow. Rook stopped. His ears moved independently. His nose lifted. "Search," Evan repeated. Rook turned left. The missing man's known direction continued straight ahead. Evan corrected him with the line. Rook resisted. Not hard, not in defiance. He planted his feet and raised his nose higher, testing the wind that traveled up from the lake. "He's losing it," Evan said. Marin watched the dog rather than the ground. "No." "The track goes north. The footprints go north." "That's the same thing." "Only if he stayed on them." Evan looked toward June. The decision belonged to her, which was unfortunate. Decisions were easier when a regulation could be blamed afterward. June studied Rook. His chest expanded as he drew in the air. His head shifted slightly right, then left. The outward-turned ear came forward. His tail, which had been low, rose until it was level with his back. This was not the posture of a confused dog. It was the posture of a dog finding something he had not been taught how to explain. Marin crouched, still several feet away. "He isn't following disturbed ground," she said. "He's working airborne scent." Northwoods certified him for trailing. Northwoods certified him for whatever sold at the highest price. Rook stepped toward the slope. Evan held the line tight. June remembered a conference room 2 years earlier. Rook's purchase file projected on a wall. Council members nodding at phrases they did not understand. Controlled apprehension. Multi-environment stability. Federal-level operational readiness. She remembered the first time a metal gate had clanged behind him. Rook had fallen onto his side and urinated beneath himself. She had been furious at the academy. Then at the handler. Then, quietly, at the dog. That last part was the shame she had never admitted. Not because she hated him, because every time he failed, he made visible the mistake she had signed. Rook pulled toward the lake again. June looked at Evan. "Give him the line." "Sheriff, the physical trail—" "Give him the line." Evan released 3 feet. Rook descended the slope. He did not run. He moved in a widening pattern through the trees, nose held high. When the wind shifted, he changed direction abruptly, crossing his own path and moving toward a narrow stand of alder near the shore. To anyone expecting straight lines, it looked wrong. To Marin, it looked like information. She followed behind June, speaking only when necessary. "Watch the head." Rook paused. A gust moved in from the lake. His nose snapped toward the southeast. "There," Marin said. Rook accelerated. The search line hissed over the snow. Evan nearly lost his footing, but followed, no longer correcting. June moved behind him, one hand on her radio. The reeds rose ahead, brown stalks trapped in ice. Beyond them, the lake stretched pale and uneven beneath a brightening sky. Rook stopped at the edge of a shallow drop. He barked. Once, then again. The sound was unlike his demonstration bark at county fairs. It was lower, urgent, directed toward a narrow depression where willow branches had collected snow. Evan looked down. Nothing. "Harland!" June shouted. The wind returned her voice without an answer. Rook barked again and dug at the crusted edge. Marin raised one hand. "Don't let him break through." Evan shortened the line. June called for the drone team to redirect toward the shoreline. The first pass showed only cold ground and vegetation. The operator adjusted altitude and angle, bringing the camera lower beneath the spruce canopy. A faint heat signature appeared beneath the willow, not on the surface, below it. The ground near the shoreline had fractured where runoff entered the lake. Snow had formed a false shelf over a narrow channel. Harland had broken through near the edge, then caught himself among submerged roots. His upper body was wedged beneath the willow, partially shielded from wind, but exposed to freezing water. The rescue team secured ropes around 2 trees. June crawled close enough to see a boot beneath the snow shelf. "Harland, can you hear me?" A weak sound came from below. Not a word. Enough. Evan held Rook back while rescuers cut through the crust and lowered a litter. The dog strained forward, whining now, but did not fight the line. Harland emerged 12 minutes later. His right leg bent unnaturally below the knee. Ice coated the front of his jacket. His skin had gone pale and waxy, but he was breathing. As the paramedics worked, Harland's eyes opened. He stared past June. "Dog," he whispered. June turned. Rook stood several yards away, shaking from cold and adrenaline. His right ear had rotated outward again. "He found you," June said. Harland's eyelids closed. "Good dog." The words were barely audible. Rook heard them. His ears came forward. For the first time since leaving the cruiser, his body softened. Evan crouched beside him and buried one gloved hand in the thick fur along his neck. "I kept telling you to go the other way," he said. Rook leaned against his knee. Marin looked toward June. The dog was not wrong. "No," June said. The truth hurt in an unexpectedly precise place. He was assigned the wrong question. By noon, Harland was on his way to a hospital with a fractured leg, concussion, and severe hypothermia. The emergency physician believed he would recover. Rook lay in the back of June's cruiser wrapped in a county blanket, eating pieces of roast beef Evan had removed from his own sandwich. June stood beside the road with her phone in her hand. She had already dictated the operational report. The safe version would have been easy. A K-9 assisted in locating a missing county employee. No mention of disputed certification. No reference to 2 years of failed work. The rescue would become a success story, and success stories were excellent camouflage. She called the chair of the county board. "This is Sheriff Treadwell," she said. "I need an emergency session scheduled." The man on the other end congratulated her on the rescue. June did not accept it. "You need to hear the rest." She reported that Rook had not demonstrated the trailing skills Northwood sold to the county. She disclosed the failed evaluations, her complaints, the denied request for outside testing, and her decision not to make the matter public sooner. There was a long silence. Then came the expected questions. What would this do to the department? Could past cases be challenged? Why had she waited? June answered each one. I believed I was protecting the program, she said. What I protected was the appearance of one. By evening, 3 neighboring departments had called. All had purchased dogs from Northwoods. All initially claimed satisfaction. When June offered independent testing at no cost through the state review, their confidence became less complete. One chief admitted his narcotics dog had never produced a reliable training alert. Another said a shepherd sold for building searches refused to enter stairwells. A third department had quietly reassigned its K9 to community events after a bite incident involving a metal training pole. Within 48 hours, Maine began preliminary assessments. The results resisted easy conclusions. A young Malinois had received little training beyond obedience, but showed strong environmental confidence. A Labrador listed as a narcotics dog ignored drug odor and became intensely focused on submerged objects in a test tank. A German shepherd labeled aggressive reacted only when a specific padded stick was brought into view, then recovered when it was removed. One dog was unsuitable for any law enforcement task. That did not make him worthless. He relaxed around an older dispatcher, followed her between rooms, and slept beside her chair while officials debated his future. Marin wrote a phrase across the top of the evaluation sheet. Placement failure is not animal failure. Gideon read the preliminary reports at the lodge 2 days after Rook's rescue. Vela lay on her side in fresh bedding, her coat beginning to lose its wet, clumped appearance. Bram nursed against her belly. Fable slept on his back, 4 feet lifted with absurd confidence. Lumen, still the smallest, had gained enough strength to push her brother away from the warmest place. Gideon had expected proof of fraud to simplify the situation. Instead, every new fact created a responsibility. If the certifications were invalidated, departments could lose insurance coverage for their K9 programs. Dogs might be removed from handlers and transferred to overcrowded facilities. Some could be labeled dangerous because of behaviors caused by fear. Others might be euthanized if no qualified placement accepted them. Silas had sold the lie. But a great many respectable people might decide the cheapest way to correct it was to discard the animals attached to the paperwork. Odalis stood beside the table, reading over his shoulder. They'll need foster placements, she said. Behavior evaluations, medical exams, some will need months. Who pays? No one yet. Who takes them? No one yet. Gideon looked toward Vela. She was cleaning Lumen's head with slow, deliberate strokes. The puppy protested, then crawled closer. Northwoods had treated dogs as products that became defective when they failed to match the label. The investigation could repeat the same cruelty in cleaner language. Invalid certification, non-performing asset, unfit for service. Different words. Same disposal. June arrived after dark. She had removed her uniform jacket, but still wore the tan shirt and duty trousers. Exhaustion showed in the set of her mouth. The board opened an internal review, she said. I may lose command of the K9 program. Do you regret filing it? Gideon asked. June looked at Vela and the puppies. I regret needing a man to nearly freeze before I told the whole truth. She handed Gideon a copy of Rook's revised preliminary assessment. At the top, beneath his name, Marin had crossed out 3 advertised specialties. In their place, she had written, Promising air scent search candidate. Requires confidence-based retraining. Gideon read the line. For once, correction had not meant erasure. June watched him. Taking down Northwoods won't be the hardest part. No. The dogs will become evidence, budget problems, insurance problems. And people will call that unfortunate. They always do when the victim has no vote. Vela opened her eyes. She looked from June to Gideon, then lowered her muzzle, across her 3 sleeping pups. Gideon understood what came next, though he did not yet know its shape. A system had mislabeled these dogs once. Justice would mean more than proving the labels false. Someone would have to stay long enough to learn their real names. The investigation stopped looking like an emergency and began looking like a table covered in paper. Contracts arrived from 3 counties. Veterinary invoices came from clinics that denied issuing them. Microchip records contradicted transport logs. Elias Penn worked through the files with the patience of a man who distrusted coincidences and preferred fraud when it could be numbered. He rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. By the end of the week, he had built a wall of dates across one side of the lodge dining room. Red string would have made it theatrical, so he used painter's tape instead. Each strip connected a dog, a payment, a certificate, and a delivery date. The pattern was ugly because it was ordinary. Northwood's billed departments for specialized training, charged private donors for rehabilitation sponsorship, and listed several of the same dogs in both categories. Some animals appeared in records under 2 chip numbers. Others vanished from the paperwork after being returned. Myron continued evaluating the dogs, one at a time. Wesley documented body condition, untreated injuries, and housing histories. Caleb sat through 3 formal interviews and corrected his own earlier statements whenever fear had made them vague. No one moved quickly enough for Gideon. That was the nature of proof. It required patience from the very people who had already failed by waiting. Vela and the puppies remained at the hunting lodge under O'Dallas's care. Bram had gained weight steadily. Fable had discovered the edge of the warming box and seemed committed to falling over it. Lumen remained small but increasingly loud, as if she believed volume might compensate for size. Vela tolerated Gideon near the box now. Not always, not without watching. But when he entered, her ears no longer flattened immediately. One afternoon, Gideon returned from moving supplies and found a dark sedan parked beside his truck. The man waiting inside stepped out before Gideon reached the porch. He was in his mid-50s, narrow through the shoulders, wearing a navy wool coat too fine for the salted parking lot. His hair was iron gray, combed close to his head, and his gloves were soft black leather. "Mr. Rusk?" Gideon stopped several yards away. "That depends on what you're selling." The man smiled as if this answer had already been anticipated. "Marcel Dane. I advise Northwood's insurance carrier and sit on the Academy's Financial Oversight Board." Those sound like 2 jobs that should dislike each other. They occasionally do. Marcel held a leather folder beneath one arm. He did not offer his hand. "I'm here to discuss resolution." Gideon looked past him toward the lodge windows. Vela stood behind the glass, barely visible through the reflection. Her head was raised. Resolution for whom? For the animals first. That is usually where men begin when they want the animals mentioned last. Marcel's smile thinned, but did not disappear. He opened the folder. The proposal had been prepared professionally. Northwoods would pay all veterinary expenses related to Vela and the litter. It would relinquish ownership without contest. A separate fund would cover temporary boarding, food, and behavioral care for 6 months. On paper, it looked generous. The final page required Gideon to sign a factual statement. He could confirm finding Vela near his camp. He could confirm discovering the puppies beneath the shed floor. He could state that he had no personal knowledge of how Vela left her enclosure, how long she had been unattended, or whether Northwoods intended for her condition to occur. Every sentence was technically true. Together, they formed a shelter for a lie. Marcel watched him read. "We are not asking you to alter your account. You're asking me to cut the account off before it reaches anything useful. We are asking you to distinguish observation from assumption. Your offer pays more if I become less curious. The Care Fund is not conditional on curiosity. It's conditional on silence with good grammar. Marcel closed the folder halfway. Mr. Rusk, litigation could delay permanent placement for months. Ownership will be disputed. The puppies may be held under state supervision. This agreement removes that uncertainty. There it was, not a threat, a weather report about consequences Marcel's side controlled. Gideon looked through the window again. Lumen had disappeared beneath Vela's chest. Fable was climbing over Bram. Odalis crossed the room with a bottle in one hand and watched Gideon without signaling. She would not tell him what to do. That made the choice heavier. "What happens to the other dogs?" he asked. "This agreement concerns Vela." "So the answer is nothing. The other matters are under review." Gideon handed back the folder. "No." Marcel did not take it immediately. "You may be refusing money the animals need. Then donate it without the statement." "That is not how settlements work." "No," Gideon said. "That's how help works." Marcel accepted the folder. For the first time, annoyance disturbed the smoothness of his face. "Silas said you would be difficult?" "Silas has shown poor judgment in dogs and people." Marcel returned to the sedan. Before getting in, he looked once toward the lodge. "They will make the same arguments in court," he said, "only more expensively." Then he drove away. Odalis was waiting inside. She stood near the stove in a burgundy thermal shirt, glasses pushed onto the top of her head. Vela lay beside the puppies, but kept her attention on the door. "What did he want?" Odalis asked. "For me to tell the truth in a smaller shape." "And?" "I disappointed him." Healthy hobby. Gideon set his gloves on the table. He expected relief after refusing. Instead, he felt the old familiar pressure of a burden accepted without knowing who would help carry it. Silas appeared 2 days later at a formal conference convened by Elias in a county administrative building. He arrived with counsel. The room had fluorescent lights, beige walls, and a heating system that rattled at irregular intervals. Nothing about it allowed drama to look dignified. Silas Ketteridge entered as if he had been invited to advise everyone else. He was 59, tall and trim, with silver hair combed back from a long, controlled face. His navy coat was immaculate despite the slush outside. A small silver signet ring caught the light when he placed both hands parallel on the table. Gideon had expected arrogance. Silas offered reason. "Northwoods exists because rural departments cannot afford metropolitan procurement," he began. "A fully certified urban K9 can cost more than some towns spend on road maintenance in a year." Elias sat across from him, sleeves rolled to the forearms. "False documentation does not become public service because the buyer is poor." Documentation standards vary. Microchip numbers do not. Silas barely glanced at him. Administrative substitutions occurred during transport. 11 times? A flawed internal process. Forged veterinary signatures? Templates used without adequate authorization. Odalis leaned forward. "My name was forged." Silas turned toward her with practiced regret. "If that occurred, Doctor, I am prepared to condemn it." "You signed the invoice attached to it." "I sign hundreds of pages." Gideon understood then why men like Silas lasted. He did not deny facts when denial made him look foolish. He reduced them. Fraud became substitution. Confinement became behavioral management. Breeding became resource continuity. Neglect became an unfortunate gap during a weather event. When Vela's condition was raised, Silas folded his hands. She was not suitable for operational placement. Marin's voice came quietly from the end of the table. "On what basis?" "Protective overreaction. Poor handler compliance. Inability to maintain task focus when other dogs displayed distress." You mean she interrupted corrections? She disrupted training. She placed herself between handlers and weaker dogs. That behavior is dangerous in a working environment. To the dogs? Silas looked at Marin for the first time with something close to irritation. To operational control. Gideon spoke before he had decided to. You couldn't sell what you couldn't dominate. Silas turned to him. No, Mr. Rusk, we could not certify what could not be relied upon. Vela relied on herself better than your staff did. That is sentiment, not training. And your certificates were training without truth. The lawyer beside Silas raised one hand, but Silas continued. People in this room have the luxury of purity because others absorbed the cost. Sheriff Treadwell kept a failed dog in service. Dr. Ferreira withdrew instead of proving her concerns. Mr. Morrow managed my kennels for years. You, Mr. Rusk, discovered one animal and decided you understood an entire institution. The accusation worked because parts of it were true. June's face became still. Caleb lowered his eyes. Odalis removed her glasses and cleaned one lens with the edge of her sleeve, though it was not dirty. Silas leaned back. Northwood survived through compromise. Rural law enforcement survives through compromise. Pretending otherwise is moral theater. Gideon felt the room begin to divide along the line Silas wanted. Everyone with a failure. Everyone tempted to defend their own. Then June took off her gloves. She placed them on the table. I kept Rook's failure quiet, she said. That helped you. Silas said nothing. Odalis set down her glasses. I saw warning signs and left before I had enough evidence. That helped you, too. Caleb's keys rested in a sealed evidence bag near Elias. I moved Vela into that shed, he said. I told myself I was keeping her alive until transport. I helped you? Silas's expression did not change, but the room did. Confession had failed to weaken them. It had removed his leverage. Gideon looked at the man across the table and realized Silas did not need everyone innocent. He only needed everyone ashamed alone. The meeting ended without agreement. Elias retained the records under subpoena. Silas left with his lawyer, still composed, though he forgot to brush a line of melting snow from one shoulder. Outside, Gideon returned to his truck and opened the metal toolbox behind the cab. He needed a ratchet strap. Instead, his hand found a folded piece of card beneath an old wool glove. The postcard had softened at the edges. A photograph of the Maine coast filled the front, taken during summer when the water looked harmless. Naomi's handwriting covered the back. He had read the first half years ago. The note came from a trip they took after an argument. Nothing momentous. No final message. Naomi had written because Gideon had spent the weekend repairing the porch alone rather than admitting he was angry and tired. He read the lines he had always stopped before. You turn every hurt into a private assignment, then you lock the door and call that strength. One day, Gideon, let somebody carry the other end before you decide the weight belongs to you. He stood beside the truck while wind moved loose snow across the parking lot. Naomi had not been predicting her death. She had been talking about a porch beam. That made it hurt differently. Odalis came outside carrying her medical bag. She saw the card in his hand, then looked toward the road. She did not ask. They drove back to the lodge in separate vehicles. Later, while she checked Vela's inflamed gland, Gideon placed the postcard on the table. Naomi wrote it, he said. Odalis kept working. She sounds observant. She was angry about a porch. Most useful truths arrive dressed as household complaints. He almost smiled. Then he told her about the missed calls. Not all of it. Enough. Odalis sat back on her heels. I left Northwoods because I told myself my work elsewhere mattered more, she said. And it did matter. Farmers needed me. Small towns needed coverage, but I used good work to excuse the place where I stopped. Gideon looked at the postcard. Silas knew exactly where to press. He presses where people have already judged themselves. Across the room, Vela tried to stand. Her hind leg slipped, but she corrected and moved toward the warming box. Lumen had rolled away from the others and begun to cry. Vela reached her, gathered her close with one foreleg, and lay down again. She had nearly died. She still answered the smallest voice in the room. June had stayed silent to protect a program. Odalis had withdrawn to protect a practice. Caleb had walked away to protect what remained of his security. Gideon had spent 7 years protecting himself from the possibility that anyone might need him again. Each choice had contained a reason. Each reason had left someone else carrying the cost. The next morning, June returned with Rook. He remained outside at first, wearing a plain orange search harness without the old patrol label. Vela saw him through the window and stiffened. Rook did not approach. He stood in the snow, nose lifted, reading the air. Marin had recommended a controlled introduction at distance. Gideon joined June on the porch. "We need a temporary network," June said. "Foster homes, veterinary coverage, handlers willing to retrain. If the court freezes Northwood's operations, the dogs cannot remain there." "That sounds expensive." "It is. Complicated? Very. Politically ugly?" June looked at him. "I was hoping that part would appeal to you." Odalis stepped onto the porch behind them. "I can coordinate medical intake for a limited number." "Pie." Caleb's truck appeared on the road a moment later, carrying lumber and 2 portable kennel panels. No one had summoned him. Marin called to say she could build the behavioral triage system. Elias sent a list of legal safeguards needed to keep foster placements from contaminating evidence. The work arrived from different directions. For once, Gideon did not refuse it because he had not designed every part. Inside, Vela lay around her puppies. Outside, Rook stood in the snow and waited without being forced closer. Between them, people who had once chosen silence began making a plan loud enough to require one another. The County Winter Training Center had been built for practical things: tracking drills, vehicle searches, cold weather obedience, the long, patient work of teaching dogs and handlers to trust one another under pressure. That morning, it looked more like a place where several institutions had come to discover which of their beliefs could survive measurement. Snow covered the outer field in a hard, bright sheet. Orange cones marked assessment lanes. A portable staircase stood near the warehouse wall beside a metal grate, a section of slick flooring, and 3 identical scent boxes. Heated trailers waited along the fence for dogs that needed breaks from the cold. Beyond the main gate, reporters gathered behind temporary barriers. They could not enter. That did not stop their cameras from pointing through the chain link. The Northwood story had leaked 2 days earlier. By sunrise, local news vans from Bangor and Presque Isle had parked along the county road. Reporters called questions toward anyone wearing a uniform. Was the sheriff under investigation? Had police departments used unqualified dogs in arrests? How many animals had been abused? No one inside answered. The evaluation was not a performance. That was precisely why Silas Ketteridge disliked it. He stood beneath the overhang of the administrative building with his attorney and Marcel Dane, wearing a charcoal wool coat over a pale shirt. His silver hair remained perfectly arranged despite the wind. A deputy had explained twice that Silas could observe tests connected to disputed contracts, but could not approach, command, correct, or touch any dog. Silas had responded by asking whether the restriction implied guilt. The deputy had said it implied distance. June heard the exchange while fastening Rook's new orange harness. Rook stood beside her in the snow, broad chest rising and falling steadily. The black arrow marking over his shoulders seemed sharper against the pale field. His right ear had rotated outward at the sight of the metal grate, but his feet remained planted. Evan Coyle held the long line. Marin Holt approached without a clipboard. She carried only her green notebook and a red stopwatch. "No patrol commands today," she told Evan. "He knows some." "That is not the same as benefiting from them." Evan looked toward June. June nodded. They began with an open field scent problem. A volunteer walked behind a canvas screen, crossed the field at an angle, then hid inside a maintenance hut. Wind came from the northwest, carrying scent away from the visible path. Rook was not shown the footsteps. Evan offered the scent article and gave a simple search cue. Rook moved slowly at first. He lifted his nose, turned into the wind, then began the same widening pattern he had used at Umsaski's. The path looked inefficient to the observers, who expected a dog to move in a straight line. Marin watched his rib cage, tail, and head. Silas watched the timer. Rook crossed the volunteer's actual path without lowering his nose. Then he turned sharply, angled toward the maintenance hut, and barked at the closed door. Marin stopped the watch. "Strong airborne scent commitment," she said. "Moderate environmental hesitation. No evidence of reliable ground trailing." Silas spoke from the observation line. He was trained for both. Marin did not look at him. "The dog disagrees." The second test involved the metal grate. Rook stopped 3 feet from it. His breathing changed. His body lowered. Evan's grip tightened automatically. Marin raised one finger. No pressure. They waited. The grate was only 6 feet long. A patrol dog certified for urban environments should have crossed it without concern. Rook looked at the surface, then at Evan. Evan crouched and placed one gloved hand on the snow. "No hurry," he said. Rook touched the grate with one front paw. Metal shifted beneath his weight. He pulled back. No one corrected him. After another minute, he stepped beside the grate and searched for a way around it. Marin wrote in her notebook. Silas let out a quiet breath that might have been amusement. June turned. "What?" "Your expert is documenting avoidance." "She is documenting the dog?" He failed the obstacle. He was never supposed to be on trial. Silas's expression remained smooth. Yet the county paid for performance. June looked at Rook. "No, the county paid you for a description." The next dog was a yellow Labrador named Moss, purchased by a small coastal department as a narcotics detection K9. Moss ignored the target odor in all 3 boxes. His handler's embarrassment grew with each pass. By the 4th attempt, the man's voice had become sharp. Marin stopped the test. "Remove the boxes." A technician brought out a shallow tank used for underwater recovery training. 3 sealed objects were lowered beneath dark water. Only one carried the human scent sample. Moss changed immediately. His tail rose. His movements became precise. He circled the tank, tested the air above the surface, then fixed on the correct section and struck the side with one paw. The handler stared. "He has never done that." Marin looked at him. "Has he ever been allowed?" The question moved through the room more effectively than accusation. A German shepherd named Cade came next. Northwood's records described him as unstable, handler-aggressive, and unsuitable for reassignment. His new temporary handler led him into the evaluation lane wearing a basket muzzle. Cade's body remained loose until a padded training stick was brought from the equipment table. The moment he saw it, his posture collapsed. His hindquarters lowered. His eyes widened. Then he lunged with such violence that the temporary handler nearly lost balance. Silas shifted. "There, that is the behavior we documented." Marin held up a hand. The stick was removed. Within seconds, Cade stopped fighting the leash. He pressed himself against the handler's leg, panting hard. Marin asked for a wooden dowel. No reaction. A plastic pole. No reaction. A rolled towel. No reaction. The padded stick returned from behind a visual barrier. Cade recoiled before it was fully visible. Marin closed her notebook. That is conditioned fear associated with a specific object. Silas's attorney spoke. Or aggression triggered by equipment common in law enforcement training. Those statements are not mutually exclusive, Marin replied. One describes the behavior. The other begins to explain what was done to produce it. No one answered. The evaluation continued through the morning. 2 dogs listed as urban ready refused the portable staircase. One had never learned to place its feet on open risers. The other panicked when the metal framework shifted beneath him. A Dutch Shepherd listed as traffic stable flattened against the ground when a siren sounded at low volume. A female Labrador marked as low drive worked eagerly for food, but ignored every toy reward Northwoods had used in its videos. Nothing fit neatly. That was the point. By noon, the idea of a single Northwoods training program had begun to dissolve. What remained was a collection of dogs forced into marketable categories regardless of temperament, health, or actual ability. Inside the administrative building, Elias Penn reviewed the digital records. He had brought 2 forensic analysts and a projection screen. On it, 11 certification packets appeared side by side. Each carried the phrase, Federal Working K-9 Compliance Verified. Elias enlarged the seal. There is no federal certification program by this name, he said. Silas's lawyer objected to the word fraudulent. Elias changed it to non-existent. Then he displayed the microchip numbers. 3 belonged to dogs different from those named in the contracts. 2 chips had been reassigned after returns. 1 dog's certification video had been used twice under different names. The videos were worse. At first they appeared distinct, different handlers, different dogs, different dates. But the forensic analyst froze each frame at the same moment. Behind every dog stood the same blue feed bucket. A crack in the wall matched. Snow outside the window held the same shape. The camera timestamp had been altered. The performance clips had been recorded during one short period, then divided and relabeled. Silas watched the screen. Training facilities reuse locations. Elias clicked again. The shadow of a handler crossed the floor in exactly the same sequence in 3 supposedly separate recordings. Locations do not reuse people's shadows. Marcel Dane lowered his eyes. The financial records followed. Training donations passed through a shell company controlled by Marcel. Police purchases were divided into rehabilitation sponsorship, equipment support, and handler readiness fees, avoiding the internal thresholds that would have triggered additional procurement review. Veterinary templates had been copied. Transport invoices listed dogs that had never traveled. 1 returned animal had been resold before the first department completed its complaint. No single document destroyed Northwoods. The weight came from accumulation. Each discrepancy was small enough to explain a loan. Together, they formed intention. At the lodge, away from the cameras and the assessment lanes, Vela underwent an evaluation of a different kind. She remained too weak for transport and too protective of the puppies for an unfamiliar facility. Marin had arranged for a quiet observational session the previous afternoon, with Gideon and Odalis present. The technician assisting her was new. His name was Nolan Price, a careful young man in his late 20s who had worked mostly with livestock. He knew to avoid direct eye contact, but as he entered the room, the door swung back toward him. He stepped quickly to prevent it from striking his medical case. The sudden movement carried him 2 steps closer to the warming box. Vela rose. She did not bark. She moved across the front of the puppies and placed her body at an angle, left shoulder forward, head low. Her weight favored the injured rear leg, yet she held the position. Nolan froze. Odalis reached for him, but Marin said, "Nobody move." Gideon stood 3 feet from Vela. He had seen the same body shape at the shed, but this time there was no blind panic in it. Vela tracked Nolan's hands, the open door, and Gideon's position. "She isn't choosing a target," Marin said quietly. "She's organizing the space." Gideon stepped backward. The movement gave Vela room rather than pressure. "Vela." Her left ear turned toward him. "Nolan stays there." The technician remained still. Gideon lowered one hand, palm visible. "You've got them." Vela looked at him, then back at Nolan. Her shoulders descended by a fraction. A few seconds later she sat, not relaxed, regulated. Marin wrote 3 lines. Protective response is selective rather than indiscriminate. Subject reads movement, distance, and human tension accurately. Demonstrates recovery when trusted person reduces pressure and stabilizes environment. She closed the notebook. "What does that mean?" Gideon asked. "It means we should not rush to make her into anything." "That sounds unusually sensible." "It is rare in this field." Marin looked toward Vela, who had returned to cleaning Bram's ear. "After recovery, she may tolerate controlled work near fearful dogs, perhaps as a neutral companion, perhaps not. Her value does not depend on making a new career from what happened to her." Gideon remembered the assessment sheet that called her untrainable. For once, professional language had left room for a living thing to remain uncertain. Back at the county center, Caleb gave his formal statement in the observation room. He sat beneath fluorescent lights with Wesley on one side and Elias on the other. Silas could hear through the open internal door. Caleb's keys were no longer on his belt. He described the rear kennels, reduced food portions, false weight entries, and the practice of hiding medically compromised dogs before inspections. When he reached Vela, his voice slowed. "She was separated when she started showing." "Showing pregnancy?" Elias asked. "Yes." "Who ordered it?" "Silas." Silas spoke from the adjacent room. "That is false." Caleb looked toward him. For years, that voice had been enough to end arguments. Not now. "The insurance review was scheduled for Monday," Caleb continued. "Vela was too thin. Her collar injury was visible. When she went into labor early, Silas told me to put her in the utility space until the transport crew came." "Why under the floor?" "Because inspectors might walk through the shed." "Did Mr. Ketteridge know the puppies were alive?" "Yes." "How do you know?" "He counted them." The room became still. Caleb swallowed. "He said 3 surviving pups made the breeding expense recoverable." Silas's lawyer stood. The interview was paused. Elias checked his phone. A message had arrived from the judge reviewing the combined warrant application. The financial evidence, forged medical documents, manipulated videos, chip discrepancies, welfare records, and Caleb's statement had reached the necessary threshold. The warrants were signed. Silas was arrested before sunset. There was no dramatic struggle. 2 state investigators approached him near the administrative entrance. One read the charges: contract fraud, forgery, animal cruelty, obstruction, and conspiracy connected to the shell company. Silas listened without interruption. When they asked him to turn around, he removed his gloves and folded them once before handing them to his attorney. The reporters outside shouted questions as he was escorted toward the vehicle. Silas did not look at them. He looked toward the assessment field. Rook stood beside June in his orange harness. Moss waited near the heated trailer. Cade rested with his temporary handler, the basket muzzle removed. Silas's expression changed for only a second. Not remorse. Disbelief that the inventory had become witnesses. No one inside applauded. Marcel sat alone in the administrative room while an investigator sealed the financial files. His company records would be reviewed next. Wesley coordinated emergency transfers for the dogs still under Northwood's ownership. Some went to heated county kennels. Others went to veterinary hospitals or qualified foster handlers. Every move required signatures, photographs, medication records, and chain of custody forms. Justice, Gideon thought when June later described it, had surprisingly poor handwriting and needed many clipboards. By nightfall, the final dog left North Woods. June stood beside the heated transport trailer while snow began again, light and dry. Rook sat at her left knee. The building behind them remained lit for investigators. Through its windows, empty runs formed dark rectangles. Evan asked whether they had won. June looked at the dogs waiting in the vehicles. No. She rested a hand on Rook's shoulder. We proved enough to arrest one man. Rook leaned against her leg. That takes evidence, she continued. Teaching them the world is different now will take time. At the lodge, Gideon received the news while sitting on the floor beside Vela. Bram slept beneath her foreleg. Fable had somehow turned himself sideways across both siblings. Lumen rested with her cream-marked chin against Gideon's boot. Vela watched him read June's message. Silas in custody. Northwoods under emergency control. The words should have felt like an ending. Instead, Gideon heard the scratch of claws against old flooring. He saw Rook stop before metal. Cade recoil from a padded stick. Dogs who had learned human intentions through pain and would not forget simply because paperwork changed hands. He placed the phone face down. Vela shifted closer to the puppies. The man who had built the system was gone from the kennels. The system remained inside the animals. That would be the harder place to dismantle. Northwoods K-9 Academy did not disappear when Silas Ketteridge was arrested. Buildings remained. Contracts remained. Bills arrived with punctual indifference. The court placed the academy under temporary administration, while criminal and civil cases moved through separate calendars. Silas was released under conditions that kept him away from the property, the witnesses, and every dog connected to the investigation. Northwood's accounts were frozen, though frozen money proved less useful than frozen ground. It could not buy food until lawyers agreed who was allowed to spend it. The departments that had purchased dogs received partial insurance advances and emergency reimbursements from seized funds. None recovered the full amount. Some municipal boards demanded immediate repayment. Others quietly discovered they had signed agreements they had never fully understood. Justice did not arrive as a door swinging open. It arrived as forms, delayed checks, temporary orders, and arguments about who should pay for winter feed. June Treadwell faced the county board in January. The hearing took place in a meeting room with fluorescent lights and folding chairs, not a courtroom. She wore her tan uniform shirt without the parka that usually made her look broader. Her fountain pen rested unopened beside a stack of complaints she had filed against Northwoods 2 years earlier. The board asked why she had not informed them that Rook could not perform the duties listed in his contract. June did not repeat her old defense. She did not say she had protected the program, the handler, or the dog. She said those things had been true and still insufficient. I chose a partial solution because it caused less immediate damage, she told them. The immediate damage became someone else's later damage. The room remained silent. June kept her position, though authority over K-9 procurement was removed from her office pending new safeguards. The decision embarrassed her publicly and relieved her privately. Rook did not return to patrol. Under Marin's supervision, he began wilderness search training in open fields and cedar stands using simple scent problems and no metal obstacle work unless he approached voluntarily. The first time he wore a new orange harness marked Wilderness Search, Evan Coyle stared at the lettering for a long while. Rook sniffed it, sneezed, and sat on Evan's boot. It was not heroic. It was correct. Gideon visited Northwoods once after the arrest. The court administrator had asked whether he would consider leasing the property for rehabilitation work. The offer looked practical. Existing kennels, Fencing, storage, training lanes, and road access would save money. Gideon walked through the front building alone. The blue signs were still on the doors. Numbered collars hung from hooks. A whiteboard listed dogs as arrivals, holds, returns, and losses. Not names. Movements. Inventory. In the rear block, the air had been cleaned, but bleach could not remove the memory of what the rooms had required from the animals inside them. Caleb waited near the gate, hands in the pockets of his canvas coat. "You could change it," he said. Gideon looked at the rows of runs. "Maybe." "That isn't a no." "It is." Caleb accepted that without argument. Gideon did not believe buildings absorbed evil. Wood and wire had no morals, but systems left habits in rooms. The easiest path would always be to reuse the old categories, old schedules, old assumptions. He did not want to spend years proving Northwoods had become something else. He wanted to begin somewhere that had never learned to lie. The property beside Gideon's house held 6 wooded acres, an old machinery shed, and a low gravel rise that drained well after snowmelt. Naomi had once wanted to plant apple trees there. Gideon had postponed it because deer would eat them, fencing would cost too much, and there was always a reason not to begin. By February, Caleb had drawn plans for 3 recovery runs, an isolation room, and a small heated intake space. Odalis reviewed every surface. "No exposed wire," she said. "There isn't any." "There will be after Caleb gets creative." Caleb looked offended. "I only get creative with plumbing." "That is what concerns me." Marin designed a behavioral intake system that avoided promises. Dogs were not labeled brave, aggressive, lazy, or broken. Their records described observable behavior, avoided slick surfaces, recovered after noise within 40 seconds, accepted food from familiar handler, guarded confined space, showed no interest in search task. Elias Penn helped draft conflict of interest rules and donation disclosures. Wesley inspected the drainage, ventilation, medication storage, and emergency evacuation plan. He rejected the first application because one kennel gate opened inward. Caleb rebuilt it. Wesley rejected the second because the quarantine sink had no backflow preventer. Caleb stared at the pipe for a full minute, then rebuilt that too. June coordinated with departments that needed temporary placement, but warned them Open Trail would not become a warehouse for embarrassing purchases. The name appeared during a meeting around Gideon's kitchen table. Several worse names had already been proposed. Northern Working Dog Renewal sounded like a grant application. Second Duty implied every animal needed a job. True North K9 was rejected because 3 businesses in Maine already used some version of it. Lumen climbed onto Gideon's boot beneath the table and fell asleep. "Open Trail," Gideon said. Odalis looked up from the licensing forms. "That sounds incomplete." "It is." Marin nodded. "Good." The registered name became Open Trail Working Dog Cooperative. Its founding statement contained no promise that every dog would return to service. Some would be retrained. Some would be placed in homes. Some might remain in managed sanctuary settings. A few might never tolerate the demands humans had once assigned them. Their worth would not be measured by whether they produced another useful role. That sentence caused the longest argument with the insurance representative. It remained. Open Trail opened with 2 licensed foster spaces and permission to board no more than 4 outside dogs at a time. The first intake was Cade. He arrived wearing a basket muzzle and refused to leave the transport van when he saw Caleb standing near the gate. Caleb moved away without being asked. Cade entered 20 minutes later after Marin placed the padded training stick out of sight, and Gideon opened both gates to create a clear path. For the first week, he slept beneath a workbench instead of in the insulated kennel Caleb had spent 4 days perfecting. Caleb did not take it personally. Mostly. "He has no appreciation for joinery," he said. O'Dallas checked Cade's paws. He has standards. The second intake was not a working prospect at all. It was the shepherd who had relaxed beside the older dispatcher during the evaluations. He was placed with her permanently after 3 weeks, where his primary duties became following her between rooms and preventing unattended sandwiches. Moss entered a water recovery foundation program on the coast. Rook trained twice a week with Evan and Marin. His fear of metal did not vanish. The goal changed from forcing him across every surface to teaching Evan how to recognize when avoidance was information and when confidence could be built gradually. Open trail did not produce miracles. It produced records that told the truth. Vela and the puppies remained under emergency foster status with Gideon until the court resolved ownership. By early spring, her ribs no longer showed beneath the wheat gold coat. The black saddle across her back had deepened, divided by the narrow wandering stripe of gold. The skin around her injured rear leg healed, though the fur grew back thinner. She still resisted anything placed around her neck. O'Dallas fitted her with a burgundy chest harness instead. The first time the buckle clicked, Vela flattened to the floor. Gideon did not touch her. He sat 6 feet away and placed the harness beside his boot. The next day, she sniffed it. 3 days later, she allowed him to rest it across her shoulders without fastening it. A week after that, she wore it to the end of the porch and back. Progress was so small, it often looked like nothing from a distance. Inside the house, it was visible everywhere. Vela stopped checking the back door after every sound. She accepted food from Caleb if Gideon remained nearby. She allowed O'Dallas to examine the healed collar line without placing herself over the puppies first. Bram became the largest of the litter, broad through the chest and cautious about hollow plastic containers. A blue feed bucket fell from a shelf one morning, and he retreated behind Vela with such solemn offense that Caleb removed every bucket from the building. Fable had no comparable sense of dignity. He slept on his back, stole gloves, and once carried Wesley's inspection checklist into a snowbank. Wesley found the paper by following tooth marks. Lumen remained the smallest. She compensated by treating height as a personal challenge. Boots, toolboxes, folded blankets, anything could become a mountain. Gideon frequently discovered her sitting on his left boot, cream-marked chin lifted as if she had planted a flag. The adoption hearing took place in May. The judge reviewed medical progress, foster reports, Gideon's property inspection, training plans, financial disclosures, and the cooperative's care schedule. She asked Gideon whether he understood the cost of raising 3 young German shepherds while caring for a traumatized adult. Yes. Time commitment? Yes. Behavioral support? Marin? Veterinary oversight? Audless? Backup care? Caleb and 2 approved cooperative volunteers. The judge looked over her glasses. You came prepared. Gideon glanced toward the back row where O'Dallas, June, Caleb, Wesley, and Marin sat with all the solemnity of people trying not to appear emotionally invested. I had help. The words did not catch in his throat. That surprised him. Permanent custody of Vela, Bram, Fable, and Lumen was granted that afternoon. Outside the courthouse, no one gave a speech. Caleb shook Gideon's hand. June handed him a folder containing the final order. O'Dallas said, "Congratulations. You now own no clean socks." Marin corrected her. He never owned clean socks. By the next November, Open Trail still had only 3 active recovery spaces. The grant for a larger medical room had been denied. A drainage trench collapsed after heavy rain. 1 foster placement failed, and the dog had to return. Silas's criminal case remained unresolved, though several animal cruelty charges and financial claims were moving forward. Civil litigation continued. The work had not become easier simply because it had become right. On the first heavy snow of winter, Gideon loaded the truck for Allagash. The gray scarf went into the cab. So did his phone. He did not turn it off. Vela sat in the passenger seat wearing her burgundy harness, ears following the movement of the windshield wipers. Bram, Fable, and Lumen occupied the rear bench with the manners of a minor weather system. Bram disliked the plastic water jug. Fable attempted to eat the corner of the sleeping bag. Lumen climbed onto the center console until Vela pushed her gently backward with one paw. The old logging road had narrowed beneath snow. When Gideon reached the lake, the same low winter sun lay across the ice, the same spruce bent beneath white weight. The campsite waited without accusation. He erected the tent and split wood. This time, noise followed him. Paws in powder. Harness rings clicking softly. Fable discovering that snow could enter his nose if he attacked it badly. Near dusk, Gideon set Naomi's photograph beside the lantern. He heated the soup she had once made whenever winter arrived early. Potatoes, leeks, black pepper, too much cream. His version was worse. Vela lay near the tent opening. The 3 young dogs slept in an untidy pile behind her after exhausting themselves across the clearing. Gideon looked at the photograph. For 7 years he had remembered Naomi mostly through absence, unanswered calls, an empty side of the bed, one scarf in a drawer. That night he told Vela about the living woman, how Naomi sang one line of a song repeatedly because she never learned the rest. How she cheated at cards and denied it with courtroom confidence. How she wanted apple trees despite knowing nothing about pruning. How she believed Orion was arrogant. Vela listened with her head on her paws. Perhaps she listened only to his voice. It was enough. The next morning, truck engines sounded on the logging road. Gideon stepped from the tent and watched Odalis's dark veterinary vehicle emerge between the trees, followed by June's county truck and Caleb's mismatched pickup carrying fence panels. They had come to inspect a small seasonal recovery enclosure near an old ranger support cabin. Open Trail planned to use it for carefully selected dogs that settled better away from roads and machinery. Odalis climbed out first. "You made coffee?" "Yes." "Drinkable?" "No promises." June opened the rear door for Rook, now steady in his orange search harness. Caleb inspected the snow around the proposed gate and immediately began complaining about frost depth. Marin joined by video because road conditions had trapped her farther south. Wesley had emailed a 6-page checklist at dawn, which Caleb described as an act of personal hostility. Gideon stood among them with his phone buzzing in his pocket, dogs moving around his legs, and Naomi's scarf loose at his neck. He still needed solitude. The night alone with Vela had mattered, but solitude had changed from a locked room into an open stretch of trail, somewhere he could walk for a while without demanding that everyone else remain outside. Sunlight reached the clearing. Bram approached a plastic equipment tub, retreated, then returned to investigate it with Vela beside him. Fable chased a loose mitten until June confiscated it. Lumen scrambled onto Gideon's boot and sat with her chin raised toward the bright trees. Their tracks crossed the snow in every direction. No formation, no obedience pattern, no marketable purpose. Only life moving where it had room. Gideon looked toward the place where the apple trees might go in spring. His home had not changed because 4 dogs filled it with footsteps. It had changed because he no longer asked every living thing to prove its usefulness before making room for it. Winter had once marked the border of what remained after Naomi. Now it marked the beginning of work, noise, uncertainty, and people arriving along a road he had once used only to disappear. Gideon bent, lifted Lumen from his boot, and set her gently in the snow. She climbed back immediately. He let her stay. For the first time in years, he did not feel that he was living inside the portion of his life left over after loss. He was standing at the beginning of something unfinished. The trail ahead was not straight. It was open. Sometimes the greatest harm survives, not because everyone is cruel, but because too many good people wait for someone else to speak first. Gideon, June, Odalis, and Caleb could not change the past. They could only stop carrying their fear alone and choose the next honest step together. In our own lives, courage may be as simple as asking one more question, refusing an easy silence, or making room for someone the world has mislabeled. Tell us what this story meant to you in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances. May God give you wisdom to recognize the truth and strength to stand beside it when it costs something.